All right. I don't have a lot of time, and we've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. So I'm going to try to get through this. I hope I don't make you late for lunch. I'll try to get out of here in time. I know it's late, and everybody wants to catch that, so that's super important. My name is Ed Finkler. I've been a developer for a long time, and so I'm a dad, and I'm a husband, and I'm a developer type kind of guy, and every once in a while I write music and things like that, and I'm kind of a big nerd, and some nerdy stuff like movies and video games and stuff like that. But I also have a mental illness, a couple really if you go by the diagnoses. And I'm just here as a person. I am not here as a doctor or a psychologist or some kind of expert or professional or things like that. That is not my area of expertise. The only expertise I really have is in my own experience. But I'm going to talk about that and some things that maybe I've learned from that. I'm basically here to talk about what it's like to have a mental illness from my perspective and some of the things that I've observed. And talk about it in the context of being a developer and part of this developer community, the open source community. To talk a little bit about my diagnoses, probably the biggest thing I deal with is something called generalized anxiety disorder, which basically means that I get freaked out about stuff that normally people should not get freaked out, and that it becomes kind of a crippling issue. Like it interferes with what people would consider normal activities. Activities that, say, most people don't get super nervous about, I will tend to get nervous about and kind of freak out about. And depression of that is a part of that, related for a lot of people. I probably suffered more from, I felt like I suffered more from depression when I was younger. Now it's kind of more of an anxiety thing, but that is what it is. I also have adult ADD, so one of the things that goes along and with that is just ability to stay focused on things and stuff of that nature. I often have trouble focusing on, say, a task that I'm not interested in right at that moment. If it's not something I really want to do right now, it can be tough for me to do that. I do better with that, especially with the help of some medication that I take. So I take a few things every day. I take something called Lexapro, which is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. It is basically a class of drugs that started with Prozac. Buspar, which is an anti-anxiety medicine. Strattera, which is a non-stimulant that's used for attention deficit disorder in adults. Most other stuff for ADD is a stimulant, so you're taking amphetamines usually for that kind of stuff. And then Klonopin. Klonopin is a tranquilizer. It's kind of like Xanax or something like that. And I take that kind of as needed. In the winter months, I have to take that every day because I just consistently get freaked out and am not in great shape. But that's so those are the things that I take every day, at least for this stuff. I take a couple of other things for other medical problems that are not related to this. So I want to talk about what it's like. And for me, what it's like is one of the things that can be very frustrating and that I deal with a lot is just this intensity of emotion. And a lot of times it seems to kind of it comes on very strongly for me, where I have a reaction to something which feels like it's a lot more intense than it might be for most people. And especially if it's something that I find upsetting or things like that, and it kind of comes over me like a wave, and a point where I feel like I can't really control it, or it sort of paralyzes me, and I have to not do anything until it passes. It's very frustrating. I've compared it to when it's really bad, it's like this. I don't know if you're ever, if you've seen the movie Kill Bill, there's this part where Uma Thurman kind of freaks out. They start playing this. It's a theme song from a TV show I can't think of now. And it kind of sounds like a siren goes, and the screen kind of turns red and everything like that. And that's tough. It's like dealing with this really strong wave of emotion that I can't control and can't get, I can't kind of let go of, and I just have to kind of ride it out until I'm over with it. And that's very frustrating. The other thing I talk about, I deal a lot with anxiety. And I guess the thing that's tough about it is that it's not sort of like stuff that you would think that is normal. I'd be kind of nervous about X, or I'd be kind of normal about Y. well, boy, I've got this really big thing coming up, like, oh, we're buying a house. There's some anxiety related to it. That's not surprising. There's a lot of stress involved in getting married or going a divorce or somebody passing away or something like that. So those are all things that are tough, and there's sort of normal places where you have some anxiety and fear and things like that. For me, and I think for a lot of people who have these kinds of conditions, what it's like is that you have anxiety, but in situations that don't necessarily call for it, realistically. You get anxious about stuff that seems like it shouldn't really matter that much. It can be oftentimes for maybe not even an apparent reason. Like things seem to be going okay, and suddenly you might have a panic attack, a really strong physical manifestation. For me, I get it feels like a knot that I get at the bottom of my sternum when it's really bad. It feels, that's super bad. I used to have something, IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, which I think is really tied to anxiety. And so for me, I think it would manifest a lot that way, in which I felt like I had to immediately take an emergency poop, like, at any time. Of course, then that leads you to being more anxious because you're afraid of being away from a bathroom. So eventually it's like, if I travel more than 5 minutes away from a bathroom, I'm terrified. That kind of feeds on that. And that's really difficult. There's a quote a friend of mine said that I thought was kind of useful. She says, I find the challenge to be explain to folks how it's not like their anxiety about a job interview or about Mondays, right? It's kind of, it's much more extreme, and it keeps you from doing things that logically seem like they're fine. And that's the struggle with it that I think a lot of people have with it. And that's where I'd call it, it's crippling in a way, right? Talk about problems focusing that I have, and I think everybody has a little bit of this. It's easier to go on the internet and, look at Reddit or, browse Facebook or Twitter instead of actually doing my work. And that's part of, that kind of leads into how does the brain work and how do we reward ourselves with little bits of information and then release the dopamine and we get excited. So that's fine, but this is more like, hey, you know what, I really need to do some work, and then I just won't do anything for like 2 weeks or something like that. Now, that's gotten a lot better, it seems like, with the medication that I take, and I don't know, maybe partly being older, and things change as you go through life, and your body chemistry changes, and the way your brain works changes, and things like that. And so I'm better at it now. I can do stuff even if I really kind of don't want to do it, and I might have like a bad day instead of a bad 2 weeks of stuff. But that's something. One thing I struggle a lot with is like these spiraling chains of thought that inevitably go to some negative outcome. Whereas, an example will be is like if I get a note and like my boss says, "Hey, can I talk to you this afternoon?" Or get on a call, and so my immediate feeling is that I'm going to be homeless like in a week. Because it's like, well, I'm clearly going to lose my job, and I'm not going to, and I'm not going to get a paycheck, and then suddenly I don't have enough money saved up to carry it, and oh shit, what am I, and that's where it ends up, right? And I'm going to be homeless and alone and die in 2 weeks, right? But that tends to be where that comes from. I tend to, read everything, particularly in text, in the most negative way possible. And so I make these assumptions about, this person is thinking like this, right? That's what it meant because they didn't put a little smiley face on it that reminded me, Nonverbal communication is actually really super important. And so the lack of it leads me to make assumptions about what people are saying and how they feel and things like that. And so based on those assumptions, now I will think that, it's going to be like X, Y, Z, and this person is now my enemy or something like that, right? And so that happens a lot for me. I have these I'll construct easily these spiraling chains of thought. That can be a really tough thing. I have a tendency to obsess on negative events, particularly something where I felt two things. If there was some kind of conflict involved, like I had a conflict with a person, that is very, very difficult for me, and I have a lot of trouble letting it go. Even when that conflict was, I think, logically very justifiable, and I think about it from a moral standpoint, a logical standpoint, no, it was very justifiable. I have a lot of difficulty letting go of that. And even things long in the past, or things with conflict, or things where I feel like I I did the wrong thing or I did something that was disappointing or let people down or something like that. For a long time, well into like adulthood even, but I was a teenager and things like that. In third grade, we had the spelling workbook we were supposed to do over the whole year, and I just didn't do it, because, I didn't want to do it, and I didn't like doing things that were work for me. So I was in, like, gifted classes and stuff like that because it was easy for me, and I didn't have to do any effort. So things that actually involved effort, like rote work, I was terrible at, would never do it, and I would just skip it and, work my way around it and never do that stuff. So, like in third grade, I had this spelling workbook, and it was like at the end of the year, and I had done I hadn't worked on it for like 6 months. And I was like, oh my God, I was, super stressing about it and felt really crappy about the whole thing. And, I tried to do like some in the last 2 days, but it was just overwhelming. There was no way I was going to get it done. And I thought I was going to, fail and they'd hold me back or whatever. I don't know. I ended up like getting a C, but like in spelling, I got a C, right? But what happened was that I would still think about that years later, many, many years later, and I would feel guilty and ashamed of that. Like, I'm still carrying that around, right? And whereas, I think most people would have been like, yeah, you messed up, it's okay. Right, you're a kid. What's the big deal? And I don't know if that was because I didn't really have people telling me that, and I don't know. I just carried stuff like that around for a long time. It's hard for me to let go of that stuff. Another thing, which is an interesting thing, there's a comedian Maria Bamford talks about, and I really recommend if you're interested. Maria Bamford, one, is super funny, and two, she talks a lot about her own difficulty with mental health and stuff like that. She deals with these ideas of unwanted thoughts and things that are popping in your head at the least appropriate time. When I was in, in junior high, I went to a Catholic school and I was raised very devoutly Catholic. My parents attend church very, very regularly, and they still go to church every day, right? They go to mass. They're retired now. I have a little more time for that. But I remember in 7th grade for a period of 2 or 3 years, and it was so not just 7th grade, but around that period of middle school period, I had these crazy things where I was terrified to get into a position where I had to be serious or I had to be seek devout and not do anything inappropriate because in Catholic ceremony there's lots of kneeling and standing up and doing things at the right time and stuff like that, and you keep quiet. This is not some kind of hippie Protestant stuff where you're playing an acoustic guitar and everybody's singing and there's kids walking around the aisles. That is not allowed. You cannot. It's not. You're not supposed to do that. So, but I had these things would pop into my head, and the stupidest jokes and the most infantile jokes is I remember there's a part in the Catholic Mass where the priest is blessing the host and going through this transmogrification to turn it into the body of Christ magically, and he holds it up like this and sort of and one time a friend of mine who I went to this Catholic school and he whispered over to me, he's like, what if he was holding up a Big Mac, right? And this is not really that, this is Jesus Christ, this is ridiculous, come on, bro. But I was I would think about that and it would pop into my head and I was like that. But so then what happened? Was that I was terrified to think of things like that in those positions. So I became very, very, very scared to be even in those positions. I became incredibly anxious about being in that. And I just kind of held all that inside. I didn't know how to deal with that, right? And Maria Bamford talks about this, where she was she would talk about going to church and having, these thoughts well, what if I went up on the altar and pooped on the altar or something like that? Or she talked about she was at an aquarium and she was in the starfish pool and she was well, what if I picked up the starfish and just this is public, there's a bunch of people around, just picked it up and flipped it over and kissed it on his poop hole or something like that. Why would that pop into your head? What is that? Why would you do that? But it's it's kind of a common thing where it's and I don't know if I've just become more comfortable with that. I'm kind of I think of weird shit and it's just kind of the way I am. But I don't have the same anxiety I used to when I was a kid. But I really, really struggled with that as a kid. Now, maybe I just know that I am the way I am and deal with it. But I think of all those things, it's this feeling that I'm alone and I'm not like anyone else. And that's the thing that I think is hardest. Because you feel like, well, it seems like everybody else is kind of okay. And like, in school, I was a kid who, would cry easy, right? And you're not supposed to do that. Sometimes people make it funny or call you a crybaby or something like that. I remember a really awful incident, and I remember it vaguely. I don't think about my childhood that much, to be honest, and a lot of stuff is very vague in my head about it. But I remember being in kindergarten, and I can't remember if we were going to say the Pledge of Allegiance or something like that, but for some reason I was very upset about, and I would have several days, it was like 7 days in a row. I remember this being a pattern where I was very upset and missing my mom. And I would start crying. I was very upset about it. And I remember the teacher said, I remember the teacher asking the class something like, should Ed be so disruptive? And do you think he's interrupting the whole class? Do you think he should be doing that? Or something like, I can't remember exactly what she said, but something that put me on the spot, and all the kids said, no, he shouldn't be doing that. And it was just horrible. I mean, it was completely the wrong way to deal with that situation. But stuff like that, I think, sticks with you. And so I felt like for the longest time, 20, 30 years. I'm in my 30s now, and I still struggle with that. This idea that no one else is like me. And with all of that is this idea that there's just something wrong with me, and I can't cope in this society, and I can't cope in this civilization, and I'm never going to get it right. And eventually you just feel so lonely. Because you feel like people don't understand what you're going through. They don't understand, like, they have these normal reactions to stuff. Why can't I have a normal reaction to something? Why does everything have to be so hard and dramatic? And that's how you feel. And you feel lonely and disconnected from everybody because you feel like you're the only person who's dealing with this. And, that is just crushing. That loneliness, that even though people are around you, that feeling like you don't have a connection with them, you don't have a shared experience with them. That is loneliness. And it doesn't matter if you're around people or not. And that is just really crushing. That feeling that there's just something wrong with me, it's never going to get better. And that led me, certainly, to have, some problems with suicidal thoughts. And some issues with self-mutilation, not as much as some people do. But I still have scars on my hands and my arms a little bit. If I point them out, you can see them, where I did stuff. And most of the time, I wasn't trying to actually, I wasn't actually trying to kill myself. But for me, and I think I'm not an expert on this. There are smarter people than me who have done work with people who do self-mutilation. But for me, it was a way of expressing how I felt, because I didn't know how else to do it. And it was like saying, I feel really, really, really terrible, and I don't understand how to make you understand what this is like. And that was the way I dealt with it. Not a great way of dealing with it, but that was kind of what I was getting at. For me, actual suicidal actions, I thought about it a lot. If you think to yourself, there is something fundamentally wrong with me and it's never going to be right, it is hard for you not to think about, why am I still here? Like, it's going to end badly. And you just feel that way. And I know that there have been times where I just felt that way, especially when I have that really intense emotional stuff. And the worst place I get into is when I feel this huge wave of emotion, and it gets to a point where I know the consequences of my actions, but I don't care. I just don't care what's going to happen to it. So I'm feeling so enraged or upset or things like that I feel like, I'm driving really fast and I don't give a shit. I'm not normally, I'm a pretty decent, safe driver. But I just don't give a shit. I don't care. I don't care if I smash everything in the house, and I don't care if I do this or that. And the worst situation was me being barricading myself in a bathroom. I was 8 or 9 years ago, and having my son's mom banging on the door trying to get in, and I had my back against the door, and I had a mouthful of pills, and that was the closest I ever came. And I got there because I felt like this was going to end badly. Fundamentally, that's where I was. I felt like that was going to end badly, and I was in this point where I just didn't give a shit. I just didn't give a shit, and I just was like, fuck this, it's over. Sorry, I was told not to swear so much. But that was really tough. And the thing so for me, that's where that was. And the tough thing is that, even without that, even if you're not suicidal and you think it's going to end that way or whatever, that this stuff, it can kill you like that, or it kills you one way or another, because the problem is that just even if you take out, say, suicide stuff out of the equation, there seems to be a lot of evidence that you're just plain going to die sooner if you're depressed and or anxious, and you deal with that stuff. And some interesting stuff I raised, that basically anxiety and depression raise your mortality rate. There's a good article in this New Republican, and I'll have the slides up after I do this, but there's a quote from this. Emotional isolation is ranked as high a risk factor for mortality as smoking. And there was an interesting study that it talks about. This was done, I think, in the mid-90s. And it compared gay men with HIV. And it compared a group of men who were not publicly gay and men who were publicly gay. So you had closeted, men who had HIV and were gay, and then out of the closet men who were HIV. And what they found was that the closeted men, you can imagine the loneliness. That you don't feel like you can express who you are, that you feel like you're going to be judged, that you feel like something's wrong with you, that you feel like you're carrying this around all the time. That closeted men with HIV died an average of 2 to 3 years earlier than men who were not in the closet. The basic idea being that an example of that stress and anxiety and depression impact your immune system. Because of the nature of it. And Robert Sapolsky, who is the guy who is a professor at Stanford, he says in this talk that I gave in 2009, which there's a YouTube link to it, and I really recommend reading it or watching it. I think it's good. Now, I should say, I think the science of the mind and how these things work and how it's all interrelated with psychology and biology is complex and is what we understand about it changes over the years, and can change rather quickly. And how we thought things were 20 years ago, fundamentally we're like, oh man, we were totally wrong about that. But with all that saying, essentially the idea I think he tries to get across, and he's done a lot of research on what kind of responses do animals have to, say, situations and things like that. Basically, the idea he's getting across is that for depression is actually a stress response in your body. And it's a stress response, the kind of stress response that you'd have from like an injured animal or something like that. And I think you could say anxiety, yeah, it's a stress response, right? And so a stress response is not just like, oh man, I'm kind of worried about this. No, actually what happens is that your brain tells your body to start flooding itself with certain kinds of hormones, things that are not present in your body normally. And it does that for a reason. But if you keep having it at inappropriate times, like it's appropriate if you are being chased by a lion on the Serengeti to have a stress response, right? Or it's appropriate if you're like, oh my God, my leg just got shot off. That is an appropriate time to have some kind of stress response, or maybe a sort of, that kind of a thing. It is not appropriate if, like, I am afraid to get on this bus because I don't understand how the bus system works. That is not the time where you should have that kind of a thing. And so so it's not like you're just, and he talks about things that like, what's it called? Muscle retardation, that people who are depressed, often talk about this like, they can't get out of bed, they don't want to stand up, they don't think. No, there's actually chemical stuff going on. It's not just like they're being fucking lazy. No, they actually have stuff going on that their brain is telling their body that to go to impact them like that. So it is actually harder to do that. So it's not just you being lazy, right? And so the idea being that you're having stress responses at a time where it's not appropriate. And the interesting thing is that one of the things he talks about is that there's certain markers that you can see. There's a genetic marker you can see for that has people who may have a predisposition to have depressive issues in their life. The interesting thing is that actually it doesn't manifest though in those people who have that marker until they've had two or three serious stress incidents in their life. A major stress incident could be like if you're young, you're like 10 years old and you lose a parent, or you go through some, I don't know, like a really terrible divorce, or I don't know, whatever, something like that. You can have these kinds of things that happen in your life. And so what happens is, normally they actually have a slightly lower incident of depression, but once they have like two or three of these major life stressor incidents, their incident of depressive conditions goes up 30-fold. So the idea being that it kind of seems like something in their brain now starts triggering this stuff when it's not appropriate, when it's not normal. I don't know. I mean, again, the medicine can change, the science can change behind that, and I'm sure we'll learn more about this in the future. But the point being that there is a real physical manifestation of this, and your body actually changes state when you're in this. It is not just this issue where just, psychologically I'm just bummed out, and if you can like get yourself out of it. It is not that easy. You're dealing with a real physical thing going on in your body. And that's really tough to deal with, and I don't know how to transition out of that. It is difficult. I was asked to not have so much profanity in here, so I put a little fun little sun on top of that. But, this is kind of rough, right? And it feels dark, and it feels difficult to deal with. But if we're talking about this, I think we start dealing with this loneliness and figuring out how we all cope with this. So what I want to talk about next is, as a developer, what is this like for me? And for me, there's actually strangely some positives of being kind of the way that I am. I think people's brains, one of the things they're really good at is doing pattern matching. That's why we recognize like faces and things where there are no faces and stuff like that. So face on Mars, no, it's actually just some shadows. But our brain naturally, grabs onto that stuff. It filters out all the stuff and it finds things that it does pattern recognition. It says, oh yeah, that's interesting, right? And that's has been advantageous for us in the way that we evolve. And I tend to be actually kind of good at that, and like not just like visual pattern matching, but sort of conceptual pattern matching, and applying patterns that I've seen before to solve, like, this is similar to this kind of thing, so we could take that and apply that in this situation. I'm not particularly like a great developer in the sense that I'm the kind of person who's like, here's a problem I've never seen before. And I'm going to come up with an awesome solution for it. Or I'm not a great necessarily an idea person who's like, this is a great idea for a business and let's execute on this model. And people are like, I'm always the kind of guy that's like, well, what if we did it a better version of Facebook? Not quite that trite, but you know what I mean. It's like, well, I've seen this guy do this. What if we did this and then just modified it and made it like this? We could do that, and maybe that would be a niche we could get into or something like that. I'm not really good at this like high level, like come up with this really awesome idea. That's just not me. I don't know. I'm not good at that. But I'm good at taking those patterns, applying them to different situations, stuff like that. I'm good at anticipating potential outcomes quickly, and that is, I think, something that comes along with having this ability to start here and see a bunch of potential outcomes out of that. And that is really helpful when you're doing things like you're trying to think about potential security issues or things like, well, how's the user going to react to that? How's that going to impact this or that? I can see, okay, if we store stuff like this, we have to be careful about this because otherwise, a person might be able to inject data into our system that we don't want it in there, things like that. I think I'm good, and maybe because I'm good at being an empathetic and supportive colleague, I think. And I think the reason is because I've dealt with this stuff a lot and tried to think about how I compare to what other people are going through. And as I've started to realize that, no, there's actually a lot of other people who deal with similar things, I think I think my tendency is that I tend to be sensitive to what people may be going through, whereas other people might be kind of oblivious to it unless someone comes out and stares them in the face and says, "This is how I feel right now." I'm a little bit better at that. And the other thing is I think I'm pretty good at, and I'm hoping to talk about this more at some point, not in this talk, but about being empathetic to users of my products. I think there's a tendency to sort of not put yourself in that place and not realize what it's like to be a user of the product that you're developing or the service that you're developing, the application you're developing. And I think I'm pretty good at that. I'm pretty good at sort of being an advocate for people who might not otherwise be sort of represented and thinking about those people, right? It's tough sometimes working with teams in a situation like I'm in. And I've done in person, and right now, the past 4 years, I've worked remotely. We're on a remote team, and we're all remote. I have to do things like I have to avoid working alone for long periods. I tend to get kind of down and freaked and just in a bad mood and stuff like that. Like, I need to check in with people. I don't like to be around people all the time, believe me. I'm kind of not like that at all. I kind of find it sort of draining. I need time to myself. But if I'm just alone all the time, that's really tough, and I have to get out of the house some, things like that. I know that's been very important for me to have, say, managers or bosses or other people who are understanding of what you're going through, try to be empathetic, try to understand your situation, and work with you on that. And that's something that a lot of people don't deal with, and I think that's a big reason why a lot of people don't talk about what they're going through when it comes to mental health stuff, is because they're afraid it's going to negatively impact them. That they're afraid, essentially, that if this person is not understanding, I'm going to lose my job. They're not going to trust me. They're not going to trust me to be able to execute correctly, and I'm hurting my career by talking about it. Does that happen sometimes? Sure. I've been lucky that generally it hasn't. I don't like working with people who I think seem like they're going to be that way, so I tend to avoid them. Of course, I'm also lucky in that I've been kind of able to choose that stuff, and not everybody's that lucky. Choose where I get to work. So all of those things are really important. That empathy that, you get from the rest of the people on my team is really important. Like with conferences and community stuff and things like that, there's some people who go to conferences and they love traveling and love doing that stuff. No, that super freaks me out. I don't like doing it. I get scared if I don't understand what I'm doing when I get to a place. If I haven't been there before and I'm not really familiar with stuff, I have a lot of anxiety that I'm not going to know what I'm doing. So travel is kind of tough for me. I tend to get just anxious about it, especially with plane travel, because everything's on a very tight schedule, and I have to have X, Y, Z documents. And if I forget my toothbrush, I'm going to be screwed. And if I'm going to be there 4 days, I only pack 3 pairs of boxers. I'm going to be fuck, man, and stuff like that. And that stuff just freaks me out. And oh my god, like one time I went to DC for a conference and I forgot my power adapter. And oh my god, that was the worst. Oh my god, I forgot my power adapter and stuff. And it worked out okay. Kind of had to go all over, and it would have been nice if the conference people helped me out with it, but that's a whole other thing. But it was many years ago. But travel's scary for me for that reason. I don't feel safe when I do that. Like, I don't feel like I'm in a safe place. I tend not to like loud parties. Like, they bother me a lot. I find it overwhelming. So a lot of things. They'll have these events and it's like some big drink up event. They're not all like this, but I've been to some where it's just like you can't hear anything, and there's like they've stuffed like 300 people into this space, and it's just eventually it sounds like just a din of static noise, and it's just like, why am I here? This isn't fun. I like to sit around and have a chat, talk with people, and then eventually leave because I don't want to be around them anymore. But that stuff just isn't. So for me, those things that oftentimes, like a lot of people sort of get excited about conferences, like it's developer spring break, and it is not that way for me. And maybe that's because I was never a person who was really into the spring break kind of stuff. So I don't know. That's just me, but that's okay, right? But I think there's a tendency with a lot of conferences and a lot of companies, I think, will often kind of exploit that and say, like, well, the easiest way to get people excited about it is if we give them free booze, right? And I don't know, being around a bunch of people with a bunch of free booze and like really like that's sort of your whole pitch, I think there's problems with that, and it's the thing that I'm not into. I guess I should say here, most of the conferences I've been in, I actually do a pretty good job in the PHP stuff. And I think this has been really good. Of course, I didn't go to that drink up, so maybe that was a disaster last night, and there was some kind of
It was terrible.
It was some kind of Roman orgy.
It was terrible because you weren't there.
Yeah, I know, right? It would have been a lot better. It would have been real mellow if I was there now. My tummy hurt. I didn't want to go. So I want to talk about like techniques and stuff like that. The things that I do, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I'm going to talk a little bit about stuff that I've kind of picked up here and there. The one thing I want to say is that I think it's important to be conscious of this, is that most of us regulate our mood one way or another. And I would say that that is consistent with the term self-medication. And medication says like, well, I have some kind of issue and I'm trying to medicate. Well, you shouldn't self-medicate on stuff. But I think even people who normally don't have, say, a lot, they're pretty stable people who don't have a lot of mental health issues and stuff like that. Well, we still do stuff. We eat things that makes us feel better. We drink coffee, or lots of people, I hear all the time people is like, they never say that, like, man, I really have a stress problem or I have an anxiety problem. And they're like, man, I need to drink. Right? Well, what the hell do you think they're doing? They're self-medicating. They're stressed out, and they're having a drink because alcohol relaxes you. Alcohol is kind of a really bad way to medicate because it has a bunch of other stuff going into it. But we use socially acceptable tools like food and like alcohol or like tobacco or things like that. Tobacco is much more, awful nowadays to regulate our mood, and we do that. That's what human beings have done that since human beings existed. That's the way that we are. Off on a little tangent, my personal feeling is I think that most illegal drug users are probably self-medicating for some issue that they have, some mental health issue. I don't think most people are like, man, they try something and if they do try it, they don't start taking it compulsively because it's just cool. I think it meets some need that they have, right? And it helps them deal with that. Unregulated, sometimes that becomes a big problem for them. And and there's different drugs, crystal meth I would avoid. But I can see why people start taking crystal meth, because you get a lot of shit done on crystal meth at first. You totally do. You're not hungry. So I have taken, for ADD, I've taken amphetamines. I took Adderall, which is a very commonly prescribed drug for people who have ADD. The first experience I had when I took Adderall, I was not hungry at all, I talked really fast, and I felt awesome. This is great. I mean, it's awesome, but what happens is that I take the same amount of it every day. Well, now it's normal in your system, right? And you get used to it. And so it doesn't have those same impacts. And I just kind of felt anxious all the time. That's why I stopped taking it. I take Strattera instead, because it's not an amphetamine. Well, yeah, of course people start taking crystal meth because it's relatively easy to make, it's cheap, and it makes you feel awesome. Great, you can get tons of stuff done. Well, of course. So, why do kids like in college want to take Adderall? Because it helps them get stuff done. It makes them feel better. It helps them accomplish things better. We do it all the time. People in South America, it's traditional to chew on coca leaves and to do work and stuff like that, to walk up and down mountains and crap like that. That is normal. That is what human beings do. And normally I really don't get into this that much. I don't know why I'm so talking about drugs here. But the point is, I self-medicate a lot with food. Especially chocolate or like ice cream or things like that. I tend to self-medicate with that. It makes me feel better. When I'm bored, I will eat. When I am stressed, I will eat. And so for me, I don't drink very much, and I take some medications that help even me out. But food is a constant, self-medication thing for me. But I think most of us do that. I don't think it's particularly healthy, but I think most of us do self-medicate on some level. For me, people ask me, well, what should I do about this? I've been having problems with things like that. The first thing I always tell people, and I tell them, I'm not going to tell you, or I really actively try not to tell them how to fix their problem, because I don't know how to fix your problem. I have learned some things that help me fix my problem, but a big mistake that a lot of people do is they advocate cures to people. They say, oh, well, you're depressed, and really the problem is you're probably living in the wrong place, and you should move to one place more sunny, or you should drink more water, and things like that. And it's like, well, occasionally those things gotta help. But for a lot of people, it doesn't help, and we don't really necessarily understand that. It varies dramatically for different people, how their psychology is, how their biology is, things like that. So, if you feel a tendency to do that, please shut your mouth. But one thing that comes up a lot is I really recommend that people just start talking to somebody about it. And that's what therapy is. It is just sitting down and starting to talk to somebody about it who hopefully has some experience, can be empathetic with you, and can maybe guide you in ways that may be helpful for you. And that would be, for me, therapy has been the first place to start. I think, often depression or anxiety it can be a symptom of emotional or physical issues. And I think therapy, finding a good therapist who's going to work with you and works with you the way that you need is helping finding the root of those things. So if you just treat, there's a tendency, and I think the tendency that I hear most people say is they go to their general practitioner and they say, I'm having these symptoms. And what their general practitioner does in the vast majority of cases is that they give them a prescription to some SSRI. And that's fine, and that's not necessarily a terrible thing. But a general practitioner is not trained to deal with mental health issues. They're just not. And part of the other problem that you have there is that is giving you something that helps treat your symptom, but it does not actually help you figure out why you feel this way. And in the end, it may be just, I have biology that has a tendency to be this way. This medication helps with that. That's all there is to it. But, that guy, Robert Sapolsky, who I talked about from Stanford, he said that, so we have a pretty good understanding of how to treat this stuff. We see these release of these things in the bloodstream, these neurotransmitters, and we know that certain medications can help increase the level of those neurotransmitters, and we have a pretty good understanding of that. And what he finds is that with people with depression, biological understanding of depression only helps treat about 30% of people, if they just treat it biologically. So what that means is there's a lot of psychological stuff to deal with that, and that psychology stuff, you deal with that. The way we know how to deal with it is on a therapeutic level, let's talk this stuff out, maybe to start doing some techniques, but it is not something where you take some kind of medication or you ingest some kind of chemical that makes you feel different. Some things that have helped people, I know, a lot of people with anxiety disorders do this thing called cognitive behavior therapy. That's basically a way of sort of like training yourself to how to deal with anxiety-ridden issues or situations, and you do exercises to kind of train yourself to how to deal with that in a different way. The way some people have had a lot of luck with that, especially with anxiety disorders. But people do a lot of medicine. Medicine helps me. I take 4 different medicines all the time, and I know I have to. I have these chronic issues I'm just going to have to deal with. A lot of people like exercise. I do not like to exercise in the winter because I don't feel like it and it's cold. But I don't really like doing it in the summer either, but I'm slightly more likely to get outside. But exercise does help a lot of people. It can help a lot of people because endorphins are awesome, and if you exercise, you get endorphins. The problem with endorphins is they don't stay in your system, and so what you get is you feel better for a while, but if you then say don't run for a couple days, you feel crappy again because it goes away. It's not in your system anymore. Some people have done things like meditation. I don't feel like I'm the person that works super well for, but some people really get a lot out of it. A lot of people have done things like light therapy. People have something called seasonal affective disorder. But I think a big thing is like avoidance of triggers for me. Like turning off my phone or like setting my Etsy host file to be, to block certain things. Like I do not think I should look at Twitter right now, for the next 24 hours. And I'll, in my Etsy host file, block that domain or route it to something null or something like that. I don't know if this is very scientific, but I find crying actually super helpful for me and often helps me deal with something more quickly than going through this cycle of getting really angry and anxious about stuff. And for me, anger is usually a reaction to fear and anxiety, and for me, crying often relieves that. Why? I don't know. It just does. Finding things that comfort me. If I put my hood up on my hoodie, I feel less stressed out. I don't know why. Maybe it's because there's less stuff going on around me. It's like blinders on a horse. I don't know. It just makes me feel better, and I feel like my head's covered. It just makes me feel better. I try to listen to things like I might listen to sports radio or listen to a podcast that's not about tech. especially comedy stuff that kind of helps me. Or talking to trusted people, and I feel like that I can share with stuff with and who are going to be understanding, but like aren't necessarily going to tell me what I should do. I don't really want a problem solved. I just want to feel better. And having that empathy, knowing that empathy is there, and having them tell me stuff like, you're going to be okay, that is what I need. And hugs. I love hugs. They make me feel so much better. And we're kind of, especially men in our culture, are kind of hug resistant. And I really like hugs, and they make me feel a ton better and feel a connection with people. It's been 45 minutes already, sorry. We're talking about helping friends and coworkers. I think it varies for everybody, and I'm not an expert on it, but the biggest thing is empathy. And empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is not feeling sorry for somebody, feeling bad for them. Empathy is understanding and trying to understand what they feel, what it is like to be that person. And that is something that you really have to practice constantly. And there is nothing more important, I think, in helping other people and helping yourself, I think, than empathy. But I would say that if you know somebody who has to deal with this stuff, help them feel safe. Listen to them and understand what it's like for them. Just listen to them and help them feel safe. Don't necessarily try to solve their problem. There is a tendency to be like, oh, well, if you do this, that's it. Don't do that. Be very careful about that, because that isn't necessarily what they need, especially right away. And if they're really feeling intense right now, that's not going to help them. It's probably going to give them more shit to worry about. At least for me, that's what I have to do. Acknowledging their frustration and understanding that they're probably really, really upset with themselves. And they know that they feel and they behave in ways that is not constructive. And they know that. And if you can acknowledge that and understand that, that's part of that empathetic process, that goes an enormous way to being able to be really helpful and supportive to folks. So you don't probably have to tell them, hey, you're screwing up. They probably know they're screwing up. Now, sometimes maybe they don't, but it's acknowledging that frustration, I think, is there. And that for a lot of people, especially people who have anxiety issues or things like that, or depressive states, like that, change is really, really scary for people. So if you're going to have a change like in an organization, like, oh, you know what, we're going to switch things around, and you're going to move over here, and you're going to move over here. A lot of times it's really helpful for me if somebody comes and says, hey, man, I think we're going to do this, giving you a heads up on it. Ask them how they feel about it and what they need. Like, what are the things I can do to help this make this easier for you? What can I do? Right? And encourage them and enable them to seek help, particularly if you're in a position where you are able to say, hey, you know what? I know these are some resources that we have available, say, if you're in a company, and maybe you help folks out with that kind of stuff. You have some knowledge of HR situations or things like that. Give them time to do that. Give them the ability to seek that to kind of help out. Because otherwise, if you don't, they're going to feel like they can't do that they have to hide that away from their job. They have to hide that away. And something I really want to mention is it's come recently, this thing called Mental Health First Aid, mentalhealthfirstaid.org. It looks like a really interesting training program that you can do. I think it's like an 8-hour thing, and you pay $50, but you can basically get trained in how to deal with how to identify and deal with serious mental health situations that are coming up. And that is something I think would be really useful. I've got some resources I'm going to skip through, and you can look at my slides if you want. Those are all good. There's one more thing I want to talk about. And this is me here, fat face. And this is at my wedding. And it's got 3 brothers. It's my brother Mike, this is my brother Brian, this is my brother Jim, this is my dad. And my brother Brian, who's second on the left, he died in November because his liver failed. And he got a really bad infection, caught up on him, and he passed away. And I wasn't that close to my brother Brian. And we probably talked more like the last year and a half than we had in our whole lives. And the thing that I keep thinking about with this stuff is that we really have a finite number of chances to interact with each other in our lives. And he had less. because he died young. He was in his early 50s. And that opportunity to interact with each other that we had was basically like 6 or 7 phone calls. And I hadn't had much interaction with him. Maybe every few years, talked to him for a little bit, and that was it. I liked him. But I think we have to ask ourselves, like, are we being a positive factor in people's lives or not? And in all these interactions that we have. And looking back, what are we going to be happy about, like that we did, looking back at our lives? And what are the things that we're going to regret? And I know this is not specifically about mental health, but that's the reason why I get up here and do this talk, is because I feel like maybe I'm having some positive impact on people's lives. And I think it's that stuff about empathy. It's that stuff about trying to understand what other people are going through, and not making assumptions about what it is, but listening and trying to understand and being a positive factor in people's lives. We don't have a lot of chances to do that. I didn't have many chances with him, and thankfully I think I was a positive factor in his life before he passed away. But that's something that has, in the past couple months has driven me even more to keep doing this stuff. If you want to help with this stuff, talk about these things, share these things. Talk, email, tweet, post, please do that stuff. If you want to learn more about the talk that I'm giving here, you go to funkatron.com/OSMI, Open Sourcing Mental Illness. I'm also part of this campaign that NGR is doing called Prompt. I really encourage you to look at it, look at what we're trying to do to raise awareness about and bring this discussion about mental health within tech to the forefront, so that we can be happier people, that we can be healthier people, that we can end the stigma that we have and this fear of talking about these kinds of things, and hopefully make things easier for everybody, not lose people for this stuff. So I know it's been long. Thank you for listening. The joined in link is down there. It's 10457. You want to check it out. And that's it. I'm at 50 minutes. If you want to ask questions, that's okay. If you don't want to ask questions right now, you just want to talk to me, that's okay too. That's what I got so far. So thanks for listening. I appreciate it.